Welcome to Policy Exchange. My name is Dean Godson. I have the pleasure of being your host at this year's John Creaney Memorial Lecture. For those of you who didn't know him, John Creaney was one of the most significant legal figures of the Northern Ireland Troubles. He was senior Crown Prosecuting Counsel in Belfast for many years, and the totality of his 40-plus year career in that post, in those sorts of positions, stretched from the original Malvern Street murders of 1966, perpetrated by a renascent organisation styling itself as the Ulster Volunteer Force, through to the first Al-Qaeda trial in Belfast of Abbas Boutrab. And it was a period, as many of you will know, of great danger, not merely for the security forces, but also, of course, for the legal profession in Northern Ireland. One of John Creaney's predecessors, Martin McBurney, had been assassinated by the IRA, as indeed were 5 members of the judiciary, such as Lord Justice Gibson, Judge Doyle, amongst others. And it was a period of great fractiousness, a period of great pressure, a period of great dangers, not just for the principals themselves in the front line, but also for their families. And John Creaney, like so many others, had to move with his family on multiple occasions owing to the threats of the terrorists. And in that connection, it's my great privilege tonight to be able to welcome his daughter, Felicity Pearce, his granddaughter, Rebecca Pearce, and who, of course, they had to move along with their parents, and we remember also, particularly tonight, since she's died since the last lecture, John Creaney's widow, Evelyn, who played so singular and robust a part in his life and in the life of so many in the community in Northern Ireland. It seems to me significant that this much admired and much loved couple who played so central a part in the life of the community, it was always the case that there was intense competition amongst that select band of police officers who constituted the close protection units to be able to serve them because they were so loved, popular and respected there. Please join me in welcoming his daughter, his granddaughter, and say thanks on our behalf for letting us. My particular pleasure tonight to be able to welcome Jonathan Hall KC, who's played a most distinguished part in his own way in the legal aspects of national security in this country, as part of a distinguished apostolic line of succession as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, but now also uniquely combining it as independent reviewer of state threats, because of course, as we all know, state threats have come up in significance compared to the years certainly after 9/11 and after 7/7, of course, which is approaching the 20th, of which we're approaching the 20th anniversary. He's been one of the most rigorous and independent-minded analysts of the situation. I know that some of his remarks have miraculously found their way into the public domain already, but there is much, much more to say. We're always delighted to welcome him here to Policy Exchange. So, Jonathan, thank you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say, and afterwards, he's very kindly engaging question and answer session, usual house rule at Policy Exchange. No question too outrageous. You simply have to state your name and organisation first. Jonathan, thank you for honouring us and for honouring John Creaney's memory here tonight.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much, Dean. This lecture is in 3 parts. In the first part, I consider an issue prompted by the atrocious Southport attack of last July. The question is, how should we distinguish between matters affecting national security and those matters, however terrible, that do not? In part 2, I look at the convergence between terrorism and threats from nation states, and in part 3, I consider national security and judicial interventionism. The reviewer of terrorism legislation, my role, now also the independent reviewer of terrorism and state threats legislation, was once described by my predecessor, Lord Anderson, as the gadfly on the hide of the beast. Certainly, the reviewer is and should be seen as an irritant. And since I've been lodged with a room in the Home Office when I need it, in very direct contact with officials and the police for over 6 years now, my role perhaps should be seen as an irritant in a more intimate place, perhaps the independent tick. To deliver this lecture at Policy Exchange, Dean, it is a pleasure. You are a vigorous and dynamic think tank, and I do think that you leave others in your wake. I wish there were more like you, and you don't confine yourselves, as other organisations do, to waving a flag or identifying concerns or raising issues, or, I find this word a terrible word, finding that things are problematic. You make concrete proposals, and that is, in my view, the acid test of policy analysis. It's no coincidence that my very first speech as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation was on Policy Exchange's concrete proposals on treason. As it happened, I vigorously disagreed. Let me say something about John Creaney. You've heard something of the range of his career, which spanned, as it seems to me, what you might call the early modern period of UK terrorism, all the way from the murder of the Catholic Peter Ward in 1966. And just for a sense of scale, that's a full 34 years before the UK had its first permanent terrorism legislation. And his last was an Al-Qaeda man, Abbas Boutrab. He had plots to bring down planes in his home, quite a chilling foreshadowing of the airline bomb plot, Operation Overt, fortunately disrupted by the police and MI5 the following year. And it's an honour to speak in his memory. It's true, actually, that terrorism in Northern Ireland can sometimes seem remote to those people living in Great Britain, but it allows comparisons and reflections across the whole of the United Kingdom and is a sound rebuttal to anyone who is short-sighted enough to think that counter-terrorism began as a war on Muslims. So, part one, as I set out in my report on my review on Southport, which was published in March, there were good reasons not to change the definition of terrorism to encompass extreme violence for its own sake. Many of those reasons were technical and operational, and none the worse for that. But that does leave a larger question. Surely the Southport attack was of a different order from ordinary murder, and therefore requiring a different response. And there are two key aspects to this. First, labelling, and secondly, what I would call apt response. A partial answer to the labelling aspect is that harm to national security is whatever the duly elected government of the day decides it to be. And in a famous case in 1964, the law lords held that the safety and interests of the UK means the objects of state policy determined by the Crown on the advice of ministers. So, CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, their activists who tried to shut down the runway at RAF Wethersfield in Essex were unable to argue, said the law lords, that UK security was better off without having American planes on UK soil. That wasn't for them to argue, it's for ministers. Now, of course, national security interests go deeper than what government policy determines it to be. Terrorism, for example, is axiomatically a matter of national security. But Lord Hoffman put it trenchantly in a judgment delivered 1 month after the 9/11 attacks. He said, "There's no difficulty about what national security means. It's the security of the United Kingdom and its people." And I will need to return to that judgment later on. 3 years after that, in the famous Belmarsh detainees case, Lord Hoffman referred in quite Burkean terms to the UK as a social organism, which more than any other in the world has an unbroken history of living for centuries under institutions and in accordance with values which show a recognisable continuity. However, this observation was used to tee up his possibly overblown punchline that bad terrorism laws were more of a threat to the life of the UK than terrorism itself. Now, the law lords, in that case, struck down detention without trial, and they were, in a sense, therefore, protecting national security against the views of the government. We see here the contours of a debate familiar to many in this audience. On matters of policy, particularly those touching the life of the nation, who decides? Who decides what national security is? Is it decided by the executive, by parliament, by judges, or perhaps by the treaties and norms of international law? In its 2016 Handbook on the National Security System, the Department of the Prime Minister of New Zealand included protecting the natural environment as amongst the 7 national security duties. But as someone wryly remarked, there are limits to what the intelligence agencies can do. Sometimes it requires real work to discern the principal basis upon which terrorism is labelled as terrorism. Take lone actor attacks. A 20-year-old carries out a knife attack to advance a terrorist cause. What is the difference between that and the savage stabbing of a stranger by a mentally deranged individual or a young boy killed by a rival drugs gang? The immediate harm to life and limb is the same, and each of these events may create concentric circles of fear that affect what Professor Waldron called the cheerful spirit of security. But only the terrorist attack is a matter of national security. Now, I'm not going to ask anyone to sort of say if they know this, but I bet that the last terrorist attack in this country will have passed you by. The last terrorist attack in this country was by a neo-Nazi called Callum Parslow, and he stabbed a recent migrant in the neck, fortunately not fatally, at the Pear Tree Hotel in Worcester in April 2024. It had far less attention and causes, I suggest, far less fear than Axel Rudikabana's attack at Southport. Now, the conventional answer is that a person advancing a cause using violence is seeking to wrest control from voters. Left unchecked, the views of men and women of violence have to be accommodated in the life of the community, not because they are right, but because they are violent. Take Northern Ireland, where the fear of violence affected and the fear of a return to violence still affects policy decisions today. The loss of democratic control is the essence, I think, of an attack on national security and distinguishes, I think, Rudikabana's case, the attack in Southport, or a case of rape or murder or school shootings from terrorism. Of course, the fear of being murdered or raped may result in policy decisions being made, such as additional police powers or harsher penalties, but even if those policies do not prove to be effective, they are at least freely chosen. That is not, however, a complete answer on the question of lone actors. Realistically, a single lone attacker shouting Allahu Akbar is not going to materially advance the cause of Sharia law in the UK or change government policies on Gaza. Whatever Callum Parslow's stated aims in attacking an innocent migrant, we are not going to indulge in forced repatriation of non-whites and the establishment of an Aryan nation. The best I can do here is to point to the collective. An attack by a terrorist group or a nation state, such as Iran, is an attack by a collective on the democratic collective. Similarly, lone actors with the same ideological or religious commitments may, in aggregation, appear as a gathering storm cloud whose collective effort cannot be ignored, can affect how we act collectively as a democracy, and can therefore be considered a threat to national security. The second aspect of this question concerns the act response. This is a major consideration and on its own would amount to effectively a positivist view that the word terrorism does no more than describe the set of problems for which a counter-terrorism response is appropriate. This is, of course, largely intuitive. Poverty is an ill, but if we look to the government for assistance, we do not look to MI5 and counter-terrorism police. Derbyshire police flew drones in the countryside above some unfortunate walkers who are defying the pandemic, and that was perhaps a good general example of the wrong response by the wrong body. But of course, the apt response theory has its limitations. Firstly, as Jonathan Sumption has noticed, society is sometimes too ready to invoke the protection of the Leviathan against ordinary fears. Alternatively, it could lead to a calcification of the basis that this is how we've done things in the past, and therefore a failure to appreciate new threats. Thirdly, the sense that really serious things deserve serious treatment can lead to the repackaging of powers created for counter-terrorism, but actually for use in other areas of high public concern. And it's a little remarked fact that the government's border security, immigration and asylum bill currently going through Parliament is replete with preparatory offences derived from terrorism legislation with nothing like the equivalent safeguards. I now need to refer to state threats. The authorities are more sensitive to the actions of Russia, China and Iran on British soil than are members of the public. I suspect that Russia's radiation attack in 2006 with its polonium-210, Litvinenko, its chemical weapons attack in 2018 in Salisbury, and Iran's murderous plotting from Salman Rushdie to the present day still do not register, like terrorism, in the consciousness of ordinary citizens. The authorities are constantly managing expectations. They want to devote time and resources to state threats. The public fears terrorism more and expects resources to be dedicated to stopping vehicle rammings, stabbings and explosions. The best evidence of this comes from the Director General of MI5. In his annual threat report of 2021, he started with state threats, but then turned to, quote, terrorism, still the national security threat of greatest concern to the public. The goal was, he said, to build the same public awareness of and resilience against state threats as against terrorism. In 2022, Sir Ken dealt greatly on the malign actions of states, but observed that getting ahead of terrorist plots was still the first thing that the British public expects of us. Why is there this mismatch? Some of this is obvious. Terrorism operates at the psychological level and is famously many people frightened, not many people dead. A terrorist who failed to deliver a message would have failed, as his action could have done nothing to advance a cause. On the other hand, crudely put, states tend to act in the shadows, behind cutouts and proxies. Our intelligence agencies are bound to know more than the general public. Moreover, whereas the public associates terrorism with bombs and death, the malign activities of states are harder to associate with immediate harm. Take long-term influence operations conducted by co-optees of Chinese intelligence agencies, or intimidation of dissidents, sometimes referred to as transnational repression, or Russian so-called cognitive warfare involving coffins deposited under the Arc de Triomphe, or the spray painting of Parisian synagogues. Some may associate state threats as taking place within or between certain diaspora groups, and therefore not a threat to the population at large. Perhaps there's something both glamorous and faintly comic about foreign spies that affects how we perceive their threat. Seeing eye to eye may also be difficult between the authorities of different states. Even close allies may have different views about how to deal with the principal sources of state threats. Different countries will have different interests and dependencies that will inevitably colour their assessments and the responses to state threats. This means a lack of shared consensus compared to a unified response to Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. Will the public view change? Well, it did for terrorism. Even after the events of 9/11 and 7/7, there was still a latent scepticism in this country about the terrorist threat to the UK, and many here will remember the reactions to the Forest Gate raid of 2006. It was the patient detective work led by Peter Clark, who's here today, and others, and careful prosecutions of high-profile Islamist terrorist plots that brought the threat home to the public. Perhaps it just takes being closer to the front line, like Poland is. In the second part of this talk, I want to suggest that terrorism is showing signs of convergence with state threats. Whilst it remains important to distinguish between them, I think it is inevitable that state threats will start to resemble contemporary types of terrorism in various ways. In December last year, the Home Secretary asked me to write a report on what countering state threats could learn from counter-terrorism, and it's just been published today. In particular, what legal measures would be useful against highly aggressive state bodies such as Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I admit, surprised at how much there was to learn. Let me give you a less obvious example. The National Security Act tackles malign foreign actors targeting the UK through their activities on UK soil or through their activities abroad. But the recent prosecution of 6 Bulgarians working for the Russian spy master Jan Marsalek shows that state threat actors may be willing to use the UK as a spy base to carry out attacks abroad. The fact that they used a guest house in Great Yarmouth with sort of comic overtones of Fawlty Towers perhaps demonstrates my point about looking at the comic aspect of foreign spies, though the activities of these defendants were in fact extraordinarily serious. As it happens, not every aspect of the 2023 National Security Act was really set up to deal with activities such as these. In terrorism, by contrast, there's long been an assumption of criminal jurisdiction in relation to overseas attacks, and that's one example of how state threat laws may need to adapt by expanding the scope of liability. Secondly, states often use proxies to carry out sabotage or cognitive warfare or assassination. This may be because their intelligence officers have been expelled or prevented from entering the UK. Partly it's because states quickly adapt to what works. So the Foxtrot network is a recently sanctioned organised crime group which frequently employs, would you believe it, teenagers for attacks and carries out deadly work on behalf of Iran. Partly because the internet offers a perfect way of directly recruiting and tasking and paying individuals. This adds to the convergence effect. Young people who might once have been attracted to a terrorist cause are now willing to carry out sabotage for Putin's Russia. They are recruited in exactly the same way by groups operating on, for example, Telegram. Pro-Russia groups might pose as protectors of Christian civilization, finding ideological affinity with lone actors. The so-called sextortion tactic of the accelerationist groups like the 764 Network, who deal in child abuse material and trying to get people to harm themselves online, could be used to obtain Russian compromat and force individuals to carry out tasking. So legal measures that have proven useful in dealing with domestic terrorist groups may therefore need to be adapted for groups involved in state threats to stop them in promoting themselves and inviting support online and offline. In addition, at a psychological level, some state threat actors are willing to take extraordinary risks in ways as irrational and incomprehensible as building bombs in their own kitchens. Take, for example, Daniel Khalif. You'll recall him, he's the soldier who was determined to spy for Iran and later broke out of prison. Individuals like that will need to be managed and their risk contained, even once released from prison. Again, there are lessons to be learnt there from managing terrorist offenders. I would, however, caution against simply merging laws against state threats with laws against terrorism. There are fundamental differences. First, the right approach to a terrorist group is to destroy it. That is not an option where the adversary is a state or a state entity. Secondly, although states can use terrorist tactics, they can cause harm to national security in less explosive ways than terrorism. Low-level sabotage and disinformation is far from the terrorism threshold, but could in time have a greater impact on national security. For example, it's obvious that disinformation measures and cognitive warfare could target how voters in this country and elsewhere think about Ukraine and rearmament. The effect on the battlefield and in turn on the national security of the UK and its allies could be incalculable. That is why I do not consider state terrorism is a useful concept. It does not accurately describe the threat posed by states. It's also apt to mislead the public and therefore undermine the call for resilience and awareness, especially on the part of those who should know better, the money men who help oligarchs, the ex-military working as private investigators, getting involved in hostile surveillance. I now turn finally to the question of judicial interventionism in matters of national security. As I wrote in a paper published last year, one of the effects of the unanimous decision in Shamima Begum's case in the Supreme Court has been to instill great diffidence as to whether and how judges can disagree with the executive on matters of national security. In the case of Begum, the Supreme Court confirmed the judgment of Lord Hoffman that I referred to earlier. As a question of law, the phrase national security means the security of the United Kingdom and its people. But whether something is in fact in the interests of national security is a matter of judgment and policy entrusted to the executive. How far does this go? Evaluating a risk of a future terrorist attack is one thing. What about the facts on which an evaluation is based? What if the question is not whether on established facts an individual poses a risk to the public, but whether those facts are real? For example, did a spy communicate with his handler or not? Did he travel to a safe house or not? The effect of Begum has led a distinguished and experienced judge to openly question what he would have done if he found the appellant to be a credible witness of truth. Did the judge have the right to overrule MI5's factual assessment that the appellant was in fact a spy? In a judgment delivered only last week, the Supreme Court returned once again to this issue. Now, debates about judicial interventions are usually couched in terms of overreach. That was the subject of the Creaney lecture given in 2014 by Sir Alan Moses, and is of course a subject brilliantly developed at Policy Exchange. As it happens, I agree with much of what Professor Richard Eakins has written. The point is fairly made that excessive intervention, particularly when driven by judge-made principles of human rights law, can remove important policy matters from Parliament where they should be debated to courts which lack the information and expertise to strike the balance between competing interests of individuals versus the public as a whole. But I want to explore what happens if judicial intervention shrinks to a nothing in relation to matters of national security. And there are, I believe, implications for parliamentary sovereignty here. In a nutshell, if judicial oversight does not comprise the correcting of errors by powerful ministers, then it may be harder for governments to pilot extraordinary measures through Parliament in response to future national security threats. Now, I'm not talking about an emergency situation such as war, although even in times of emergency, courts have a role to play. And it could be argued fairly that in the face of COVID regulation and its effect on young people, civil society was far too passive. I'm thinking about the measures that may one day be needed to save democracy from itself. And what do I mean? I'm referring to counter-subversion. That is, to slow burn damage to national security rather than the more catastrophic potential of terrorism, where, as is apparent from the Supreme Court's judgment last week, a precautionary measure is of course necessary, and where the constitutional aspects in such a case are starker, because the government can say, faced with a terrorist attack, it is of course the first duty of government and not the courts to keep the population safe. The term subversion used to be central to internal security in this country. The famous Maxwell-Fyfe Directive of 1952 directed MI5's task as defending the realm from internal dangers arising from actions of persons and organisations which may be judged to be subversive to the state. A declassified top-secret memo from 1972 contains the terms of reference for an interdepartmental group for long-term intelligence reports on subversion in public life, i.e., to collect intelligence on threats to the internal security of Great Britain arising from subversive activities. But the terminology of subversion did not find its way into the Security Service Act of 1989, and the very concept of counter-subversion fell out of favour, associated with McCarthyism and some unjustified infiltrations of domestic protest groups by undercover police officers. But if I was a foreign intelligence officer, of course I would meddle in separatism, whether Scottish independence or independence of overseas territories or Brexit. I would encourage extreme forms of environmentalism, hoping that policies generated would damage my adversary's economy or at least sow discord or hopelessness. I would sponsor Islamism and Islamist MPs and contentious foreign policy issues such as Gaza within politics. Social media would be a delightful playground for wedge issues. I would certainly amplify the lie that the Southport killer was a Muslim who arrived on a small boat, and I would relish any case where an attacker had previously claimed asylum. I would ensure the UK hated itself and its history, that the very definition of woman should be put into question, that the masculinity would be presented as toxic, and that white people should be ashamed and non-white people aggrieved. I would promote anti-Semitism. My intention in doing this would be to cause both immediate and long-term damage to the national security of the UK by exploiting the very freedom and openness of the UK itself, by providing funds, by exploiting social media, and by entryism. Now, there might be some immediate gains, for example, forcing the relocation of a nuclear submarine base, or some longer-term gains, such as a loss of trust in the government trying to raise defence spending. Or it might allow me to position Russia as the true defender of crumbling Western civilization. Please note, I am not saying that I have evidence of foreign involvement in any of the topics I've just listed, but there is no harm in thinking like an adversary. One answer is, of course, the new National Security Act 2023 and the offence it contains of foreign interference, but proving that the foreign hand is at work is incredibly difficult. Another answer, advanced by MI5's DG in 2021, is social resilience against disinformation, or you might even say a Cold War mentality that sniffs out subversion. Now, truth and resilience require a degree of trust in institutions, where the UK is, I think, still lucky. The royal family, the jury system, the BBC, I'm thinking of its excellent VE Day coverage, as well as the snooker, the police, the security services. These are domains, I believe, of institutional trust in which the UK has incalculable advantages compared, for example, to the United States of America. A further set of answers must deal with life online, and this would require an entirely separate lecture. But in headline, and for various reasons, content moderation, that is removing, blocking, limiting, downranking access to certain content, is never going to sufficiently address the unprecedented access that the internet accords to impressionable minds. Major steps, I suspect, in this field are required to limit child access, whether banning access to social media, as Australia has just started to pioneer, or in my dreams, a limited functionality BBC phone provided free to all children under 16, distributed by the NHS. Now, the Online Safety Act 2023 is not the complete answer. And we must also be very careful not to learn the wrong lessons from the TV series Adolescence. But what if it was necessary to go further? What if it was necessary to investigate, intrusively, the source of fundings of protest movements? What if it became desirable to pass a law banning Muslim Brotherhood candidates from standing in elections, or to bring forward a law in the interest of national security banning extremism or subversion? Now, I recall the excellent Colin Cramphorn Memorial Lecture delivered in this very room by the French Interior Minister Bruno Retailleau on the threat of Islamism. It's, of course, one thing to take steps of banning the Muslim Brotherhood in an autocracy, but it's quite another thing in a democracy like France or the UK. Our laws are based on general principles that apply to individuals equally. And so if the Muslim Brotherhood was to be banned, the basis would have to be that it met a general criterion, such as terrorism or legal criteria that we've yet to invent, separatism or hateful extremism or subversiveness. There are very many difficulties in achieving an appropriately clear legal test, and the road to a legal definition of extremism is littered with wreckage. But my modest point today is that if a sufficient definition could be found, then new laws would need sufficient safeguards in the form of judicial intervention, not cowed by excessive deference to the executive, but ready to correct things when they go wrong. The history of national security legislation is that measures generally become tougher and more imaginative. And I don't doubt that's sometimes necessary. And I think it's inevitable the National Security Act 2023 will only be a starting point. But when future governments propose exceptional measures in the national security field, the willingness of judges to disagree with the executive should be a comfort to parliamentarians worried about leeching away of precious rights. So my point today is not about the rule of law. It's not even about the protection for the rights of the individual. It's about policy choices. As a criminal lawyer by origin, my first observation is that the definitive choice between guilty and not guilty made by juries is the best and most widely accepted guarantee that laws against terrorism are valid. And if we come to counter-subversion measures, they will be accepted, if they are accepted, by allowing judges to decide. So, I will conclude by summarising my points. The boundaries of national security are hard to find and are liable to change. Terrorism and state threats are separate concepts, but show signs of convergence. And finally, new laws in this area require sufficient safeguards, and if this means intervention as judges, then so be it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure many questions on the basis of that. I'm just trying to get a sense of who in the room wants to. Gentleman front row, name an organisation, please. Just wait till the microphone comes so we can.
Thank you, Dean. Joshua Rosenberg. In the middle part of your lecture, you said that one can't conflate terrorism and state threats, and you referred to your report to the Home Secretary, which is published today, and as you know, the Home Secretary has accepted your report this afternoon, showing the power and influence of policy exchange and the speed with which your remarks get to the position of power. And what she said was that the government will create a new power of proscription to cover state threats. And by referring to calling in the Iranian ambassador and 3 Iranians being arrested, she made it pretty clear that that power of proscription would be or could be used against Iranians. Now, how does that fit in with the government's current wish to keep diplomatic relations with Iran if the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is presumably what she's referring to, is going to be proscribed? Is it possible to continue to have diplomatic relations with the organization representing a country that's being proscribed? And how do you think this is going to work, given that this is what you're recommending and given that this is what has been accepted?
I was trying to create some options for government, whether they choose to use the options or, whether they want to create the tool and whether they want to use it against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is up to them. I suppose I was trying to suggest that there is a gap at the moment between terrorism prescription, which I'll come back to and I think what it means, and sanctions. many people say that sanctions are sometimes the cost of doing business and therefore are to be expected and won't have the sort of impact that prescription might have. But prescription of the Terrorism Act literally means to ban, and calling something a terrorist, I think, means you are illegitimate. There are many people, those, for example, who left in 1979, who do say that Iran, under the Ayatollahs, is an illegitimate state that ought to be banned and is fundamentally unlawful. It seemed to me that that is quite a tough ask, both to prescribe in that sense and to continue diplomatic relations. So whether it's used or not, I was trying to suggest that there is a space between the two, between prescription with all that that carries and sanctions, which seem to be insufficient.
Gentleman there in the second row. Sorry, name and organisation, please.
Tobias Elwood, former Defence Minister. You mentioned Shamima Begum. I'm just curious, I remember this debate vividly in the House of Commons. My concern, taking interest in overseas terrorism, is that if these people can't be looked after at source, when she was in Al-Hal camp, I think it was, and they have a British passport, is there not a dereliction of duty if we don't take our own citizens back, as America and other countries do, to make sure that we can either rehabilitate them or then lock them up? And can I also ask, as you touch on terrorism more widely, and you relate it to state threats, do you believe that the growth in threat levels of terrorism is likely to see another attack on the UK mainland?
Thank you. I mean, on Shamima Begum, I mean, I've taken a different view of this than both certainly the past and it appears the present government, which is I think that the UK is able to absorb the threat posed by individuals such as Shamima Begum. And I think like others, I've always found that the deprivation of her citizenship to be rather artificial. I mean, she could never have gone to Bangladesh. I have to say that I struggle very much with the threat posed by some of the men. And I don't think I would go so far as to say that you should never use the tool of deprivation. I mean, there were some male individuals who were so risky, and had they all returned at the same time in around 2014 to 17, I can see that would have been a real challenge for the authorities. So I wouldn't say no to deprivation at all times. On the question of the further risk, I mean, gosh, I'm not going to predict. I mean, the only thing I would say is we never seem to predict the threat until it arrives. I mean, no one, for example, seemed to predict the phenomenon of Islamic State. So I think we'll just keep an eye out.
Others. Gentleman there. Were you seeking to catch my eye?
Who, me?
You.
Yes.
Yeah, you were. Name and organisation, please, Dick.
Sorry, Dean. I'm Ken MacDonald. I'm a crossbench peer and in former life at DPP and prosecuted a number of the cases that you've referred to, which were investigated by Peter Clark, who I haven't seen for many years. I hope to speak to him later. I wanted to address this question of subversion, which I think is very interesting and also very difficult. I mean, I agree with you this. There is conduct outside terrorism legislation and outside the National Security Act, which we ought to be capturing. You've said that many people have spilt a lot of ink trying to define political extremism, and I've never managed satisfactorily to do that to myself. Have you been working away in your own mind at a definition of subversion? And if you have, and have got anywhere close to something satisfactory, could you share it with us?
No, I haven't. I'm currently looking at how to deal with Hashim Abedi in separation centres, so that's occupying my bandwidth at the moment. I mean, I think what I had in mind, in a practical sense, is who investigates, I suppose, would be my first question. There may be a question further down the line about whether you need to have a law or would want to have a law banning something, and extremism is very hard, as we know, but I suppose you'd want to know that if there was a truly subversive mass movement group that was using our free and open society in order to frankly subvert. I mean, it happened in the 1930s. Imagine if you had a sort of Islamist caucus who said we will use the freedom and openness of the UK society to abolish democracy, for example. At the very least, I hope that someone would investigate that. And I don't know whether that is something that would happen because of the remit of our intelligence agencies and the thresholds at which counter-terrorism police operate. So I think, in a practical sense, we need to look at these things, and perhaps when we look, we might work out what to do about it.
see many other questions. I'm just trying. Gentleman there, towards the front, there. Name and organisation, please.
Thanks. John Gearson from King's College, London. Thank you very much for the lecture. I mean, Britain may have done national security for many years, but we've only called it national security for 15, 16 years, really. And we've been creating structures which are supposed to essentially deliver an administrative function more efficiently and identify threats. But I wonder, with the exception, I'd say notable exception of some of your work, our methodology and our capability for oversight, and therefore the public confidence that you talked about at the beginning of your talk, doesn't seem to be keeping pace with the enormous areas of government activity that are now being put under the title of national security. And I wonder whether really can we leave that to judges to sort out?
The answer is you can't leave it just to judges, because judges are going to deal with the cases that come in front of them. I think that there was an academic called Jessie Blackburn who looked at what she called the counterterrorism oversight assemblage. I think she left one thing out, which actually is the press. And one of the things, and I'm not trying to sort of ginger up all the journalists in the room, but
Go on.
but I have found them actually really impressive. The security correspondents of the newspapers and the broadcast media are both responsible, often trusted and given privileged briefings, which is a great thing, and also willing to look at it. It's not the same in other countries, actually. Or even other parts of the UK. In Northern Ireland, there's very little appetite, maybe because it's just neuralgia, not wanting to look at it. In the Republic of Ireland, equally. I've also found that's the case in Australia. So, I think that it's got to be a shared responsibility, but I do think the press is very important in this.
Lady there by the white pillar. Name and organisation, please.
Baroness Foster of Oxton, because there's Arlene Foster, my good colleague. I'm in the House of Lords. 2 points I'd just like to raise. The first one is on Islamic extremism, and clearly the rise and influence of the Muslim Brotherhood over the last 30 or 40 years. We clearly have to take... I'm okay. Can you hear me? Okay. We clearly have to take a hard line on this, but what we have seen mosques up and down this country who've basically been infiltrated by clerics who the Home Office give out visas for Iranian clerics coming here. We know that they're calling for death and destruction and jihad, and this has gone on for years. It's not getting any better, and we've got children now in Islamic schools who are basically being brainwashed, and when there is an incident, people are cheering, and this is clearly not good enough. So whilst we can have a wide-ranging debate about all of these things, how we deal with it, how are we dealing with this rise, which is putting a huge amount of, I think, difficulty within communities around the country? And a very brief second point, if I may. You touched on social media, which is very powerful. And we have a case at the moment, and it is being judged on, about a woman who made a comment on Twitter after the Southport attacks, which are quite close to my heart because I'm from not far away, who was given a 21-month sentence. And my query there is the judiciary becoming politicised? Because when people looked at that sentence, and people do much worse and get much less, how can that actually be justified? It's now obviously being appealed, but that's just one example of now where government appears, or whoever appears, to be sort of manoeuvring into the whole social media, and people are being closed down when they want to actually express very, very serious views.
On the judiciary thing, I happen to think that it's entirely okay to agree and disagree with judges. As long as you don't insult judges. Personally, I think agreeing and disagreeing with judgments is completely fine. I think that's a bit harsh. Some of the best judgments recently defending free speech, for example, defending the rights of people to take gender-critical views, have in fact come from the judiciary. No judge is completely isolated from the currents of the country within which they live. But I think it follows from what I was saying in the third part of my speech, so I probably trust judges perhaps a bit more than you do, and these things should be worked out. On the first question, which is about the Muslim Brotherhood, I candidly don't know is the answer. the point of my speech is partly to just acknowledge the fact that that is a genuine and legitimate concern. I've been to enough lectures, many of them in this building, of people saying something must be done. And the point I'm trying to make is it's really, really difficult. But if you are going to do that, then I think you've got to have pretty tough oversight of it. And hence my point about judicial interventionism. But I haven't got any answers on the Muslim Brotherhood point.
Others, I see there were other. I see a hand in the middle, a few towards the back there, yes. Sorry, just on that side, yeah. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you very much. Becca Stewart from the Joint Extremism Unit. You mentioned early on about the principal basis of labelling terrorism as terrorism and the loss of democratic control. What do you think that means then for those mixed, unstable and unclear ideologies and individuals that don't have a clear ideology that they're trying to further, and whether that can still technically be labelled terrorism if it's about that loss of democratic control?
I'm a bit disappointed in your question because if you're from the Joint Extremism Unit, either you haven't read my report on Southport or you disagree with it, which is fine. In my report on Southport, I do try and say that I think mixed, unclear, uncertain ideology, salad bar extremism, pick and mix are all hopeless terms. And they tend to mask a sort of lack of intellectual rigour and analysis. When people talk about salad bar extremism, what they probably mean is something that's quite new, something they haven't necessarily encountered before, but it certainly means a lot to the person who goes and carries out the attack. And I think that we should try and get completely away from that. And in most cases, if someone is propounding some view that you've got to bring on the end of the times so that you can have a showdown with the Jews, which is quite a sort of typical thing, whether it's, you know, Satanism or neo-Nazism, that's often where they're getting to, is to say, well, that amounts to advancing a terrorist cause. There'll be some people who are not. But I would really move away from that idea of MUU.
There was another hand up there I thought I saw near the last questioner. Am I right? Yeah. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you. Ellie Knight, and I'm also from the Joint Extremism Unit. And I think you kind of covered some of what I was going to ask there, because it was just to consider when you talked about the definitions of terrorism, you spoke about sort of furthering a cause rather than using the term ideology, and enjoying parallels to young people being drawn into state threats, which again, there may be a lack of ideology. I was just curious as to whether you think our approach should be shifting away from focusing so much on the ideology rather than the sort of factors that might lead someone to be drawn into state threats or terrorism or anything that could try to recruit them.
Well, I think that in the case of young people, I think that I think everyone involved in counter-terrorism has a duty to young people so that so far as possible they don't find themselves arrested at 5 a.m, whether it's for assisting some white knights neo-Nazi thing, some sort of Islamic State thing, or some sort of Wagner Group Putin thing. As you know, I've recommended that there should be a lot of diversion in this field, and it's slightly technical, but the youth diversion orders which I've recommended, which now is going through Parliament at the moment, the point about that is it's slightly more threat neutral. So it doesn't matter whether the threat from that child might be towards simply violence or state threats or terrorism. It'll be available in all those cases.
Others, please. Do I see one else just trying to get a flavour of the room? Gentleman there in the second row.
Thank you.
Name and organisation, please.
Danny Shaw, freelance journalist and commentator. Jonathan, thank you very much for the speech. You mentioned that you're doing a review at the moment of separation centres. I know you did a big paper, I think, a couple of years ago that touched on that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us whether you have any observations at the moment, based on your previous research and any work that you're doing at the moment, about the possibility of a supermax-style regime for some of these offenders?
Yeah, I think you've got to... I've put out an issues paper, which I think you've seen and kindly commented on. In the issues paper, I've deliberately invited people to consider, as part of any response they want to me, what the implications would be of a supermax type prison. So both the human implications for the individual, but also the benefits that there might be or not. I mean, I've been quite interested in the ADX Florence prison because it formed a really important part in UK litigation. So when a lot of terrorist prisoners like Haroon Aswat and Baba Ahmed were being extradited to the US, they said this is going to be a breach of our Article 3 rights, so the right against cruel, unusual, inhuman degrading treatment. And the courts looked quite closely at it. And I mean, I think the surprising thing is that it's not quite as bleak, and in some respects, and there was evidence on this, in some respects it's less bleak than some of the separation centres and close supervision centres where people are currently held. I think the only observation I'd make so far is I have found that in separation centres there is an extraordinary lack of cooperation with the regime. So the whole point of a separation centre regime for those who are in it is to progress out of it, and that will involve having some sort of relationship with offender managers, psychologists to discuss your offending and maybe to move on. At the moment, that's been completely negated. People are not doing that at all. So you have the facilities to people to acknowledge their offending, it's not being taken. And that's a very early sort of striking observation. But I've only been doing this now for a few days, so I'll come back to you on that.
I see several other hands were up. I'm just trying to get a flavour. Gentleman just behind there. Name and organisation, please.
Hi, Jonathan. Duncan Garden, one of the security journalists you were saying is so good earlier on. Hope I don't annoy you too much. But I was just thought we'd put a slightly countervailing opinion here, having just listened to the Commons debate around your proposals earlier, and it was very much a kind of everyone supporting it, really. And I was just wondering whether we might actually be in danger here of rushing in to a whole new legal framework for a relatively small problem. And I know you've slightly highlighted that in your speech insofar as, you know, that the concentration is, that the public fear, if you like, is around terrorism and mass casualties and stuff like that. And actually this is a lot of law to deal with a relatively small problem. Is it just to do with Iran and maybe a little bit of Russia and a right now problem, or is it a bigger one?
I thought that it was sufficiently serious to warrant creating a legal mechanism. What you'll have seen, it's slightly technical, but one of the proposals I have is that were the Secretary of State to use what I've called a SALT notice, it could apply not just to a state but also, and this may seem almost rather bizarre, to a freewheeling body that sets itself up and says we are willing to carry out state threat type activity without yet having been tasked, but we will then offer the proceeds of our state threat activity to a state. And if you just think about the Rusev trial, although they were being tasked by Jan Marsalek, one assumes in Moscow, there are entities who will be there, who will be prepared to do things for. Imagine, hypothetically, as a Wagner group stands up and says, I'm going to go and do it. Now, at the moment, that entity, which would look and feel very much like a foreign intelligence service, wouldn't count under the Act as a foreign intelligence service. So, as well as the designation of traditional intelligence services within a state, I've also proposed that should apply equally to those people who are doing things not because they've been tasked, but because they're acting for the benefit of, without tasking, for the benefit of a state.
Just trying to get a flavour, the glare of the lights. You know, who wants to ask a question? Gentleman in the second row there. Name and organisation, please.
Hi, it's Tom Clementi from Poolree. Jonathan, we're at Poolree in the business of providing insurance cover against terrorism. We're the UK's government-backed terrorism insurer. So we cover terrorism, but we explicitly exclude war. And we found that trying to articulate a workable means of differentiating between an act of terrorism and an act of war, where states are involved in some capacity, can be tricky.
Yeah.
I wonder, what is it that you would look at to determine whether you would lean one way or the other?
I mean, I would look at the nature of the entity. So if it is a pure state body, genuinely part of there, so you've got some GRU operatives or IRGC officers, on my analysis, I know you've got a slightly different statute from the Terrorism Act, but my analysis, that would be the definitive difference. But I would completely accept that if you had a private body that was carrying out state threat activity, so like the Wagner Group, as long as it's doing that to advance a cause, it may be very pro-Russia, very anti-Ukraine, that could count as terrorism. As you know, the Wagner Group was in fact prescribed under the Terrorism Act. It was a slightly awkward fit because it didn't allow the effect of really calling out Russia. It made it look as if it was like a private endeavour. Actually, what you want to say in some cases is we're going to prescribe this group because it's doing this for a particular country. But I think in theory, the key difference is the personnel.
Just trying to get a flavour here. Who wants to ask a question? There seem to be loads of questions. Gentleman there in the middle. I can't. Name an organisation, please.
Thank you. Michael Stewart, wanderer across the counter-terrorism landscape. Jonathan, I want to ask you a definitional question and whether there is in your definition of terrorism any scope for method as well as motive. And I'm thinking of two examples here. The case of Imad al-Suwaylmin, who blew himself up outside Liverpool Women's Hospital, where there is really today no understanding of motivation, but that was described an act of terrorism. And also the increasing proliferation of what looked like hobbyists engaged in chemical or biological warfare, including Axel Ruder-Kobane, where the potential to really frighten the public to a disproportionate level appears in simply considering those. Do you think method is a reasonable way of looking at terrorism?
No, I don't. I think what I would say is it's a matter of evidence rather than definition. So it seems to me that if someone is, so take the Suwaylmin case, he was the Liverpool Women's Hospital bomber who turned up in a taxi with a suicide vest strapped to his back. That method, and I mean, I admit I was slightly sort of blindsided by that when I was told, well, it's not being treated as terrorism. But, you know, that looked like a classic terrorist method. And I think I would say to police and prosecutors, be prepared to draw inferences. It's what people do. I think the fly in the ointment there is, of course, as we know, as you know, Michael, the number of terrorist manuals online mean that many people, without being a terrorist, can adopt a methodology. But I wouldn't make it part of my definition.
I see one or two people have been waiting patiently towards the back. Right at the back there. Yes, please, name an organisation. I can't see who it is. But.
I'm Joanne Nadler, freelance journalist. You, I think, very interestingly identified the importance of bolstering social resilience through our social and cultural institutions. And you mentioned the BBC and its coverage of VE Day, which was commendable. But I wonder how concerned you are about many of our institutions having actually been captured to a certain extent by some of the ideologies that you had previously listed as being divisive and problematic, to use a word that none of us like, but sometimes comes in useful.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about those things too, but on balance, I mean, I said I defended the BBC partly to tweak the nose of the audience here, but I mean, on balance, these institutions are still better. I mean, let me give you an example, I think, where the institutions got it right, which was in saying that the 3 Iranian nationals who've been charged under the National Security Act were irregular migrants. They entered the UK irregularly. Now, where they got it wrong was after Southport, and you remember, it now appears, it's in the public domain, the police were desperate to say that the religion of Axel Ruder-Kobane was Christian. That was vetoed by the local CPS in Merseyside. And we know the consequences, or appears to be the consequences, there was the information vacuum. That was a good example of where the institutions got it wrong and they attracted the sort of, you're all in it conspiracy. I actually think the way in which the government handled this announcement was good. They got it out, they did it in a sober way, there haven't been massive riots, people feel they're not being lied to. I know that's not completely answering the question, but I mean, I think I'm saying institutions are pretty good things, I think, when it comes to thinking about truth again. I mentioned truth as well as resilience. If we had what you might call a national security attack on the information domain before an election, and there was a picture of the leader of the opposition or candidate for Prime Minister in some very compromising position on a deep fake that went viral. We do need institutions, don't we, who are sufficiently trusted to call that out. And I don't know quite who that would be. Would that be the National Cybersecurity Centre, the Electoral Commission? Would it be the BBC? I mean, I sometimes disagree with what the BBC's editorial policy seems to be on certain issues, but I do think having big institutions that are generally trusted is a really good thing.
I'll just ask you one question, Jonathan, just touching you kind enough to refer to Bruno Retailleau's Colin Crampton Memorial Lecture here a couple of months ago. And he, of course, talked about the materials that he's declassifying now, and there's a discussion in France on the Muslim Brotherhood with what we would call the agencies here. And they, of course, in Germany, the Verfassungsschutz regularly publishes, counterpart of our security service regularly publishes, a whole set of materials on domestic, quote, subversive threats to the German constitution. The Dutch AIVD and other organisations on the continent do as well. I'm just wondering whether you were just, in terms of at this phase of diagnosis of what you've called subversion, whether you'd like to see a sort of greater openness. We did dip our toe in a little with Sir John Jenkins's review with the late Charles Farr on the Muslim Brotherhood 2014-15, which I think disappointed some of the Gulf countries in respect of not calling for subversion, and it was heavily redacted, but a small bit was laid before Parliament. Just like your reflections on whether we could do more in that openness space following the best practice of continental partners.
Yes, I think we could. I think that transparency is vital. It creates public trust and confidence. It means that when debate happens, it's better informed. I mean, I'm thinking even about the Australian ASIO. Their threat assessments are very, very detailed, and they spell out in quite a lot of detail the sorts of insidious subversive activity that's happening there, of which they are very, very worried indeed. So I think I agree. More information, please.
We're in violent agreement with each other then. It's good news. Just a couple more questions, because our guest of honour has shown great resilience tonight, but I don't want to test him too far. Resilience is an important new word of the era. Others, please. I know there's several others. Who do I see? There seem to be a whole load of questions. I seem to have deterred them now.
Someone there, and then someone there.
Yes, sorry. A second bite of the cherry.
Someone there. Okay.
Forgive me, it was just prompted by another question. It was to do with social media and the power that has in our lives today. And that, I say as a former legislator, that our world hasn't really adapted to this, and the ability of the terrorist to take advantage of the anonymous capabilities that are there. Do you believe that anybody using social media should be accountable by having to pay 1 penny, let's say, to a credit card company? Because ultimately it is able to sow discord. We saw that with Southport as well, but much further afield. And I believe that this is something that we've yet to grasp as the huge impact this has had on our way of life. The digital impact is increasingly negative than it is positive.
Can I just ask, since you've had a second bite of the cherry, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I do mean to put you on the spot at the same time, but in a genuine way, because of what you and your family underwent when demonstrators came to your house, just the role of social media in organising that, and B, whether the police and other agencies were sufficiently cited on coordination and attempts to harass you and your family after the events of October 7, when ministers such as yourself got abused.
Yeah, I mean, it's very pertinent in that case. People were able to rally very, very fast using an anonymous capabilities into a tiny little village in Dorset. They actually directed this mob of 80 to the wrong house, and little Mrs. Miggins came out saying, "Elwood doesn't live here, go round the corner," which didn't help my situation. But it was actually exactly that. It was the ability very swiftly, and then not able to then pinpoint who exactly was the responsible organizer behind this, making it so simple now to do, and to take advantage of hate, which I'm afraid is very, very easy to do in today's society.
Well, I think I'm going to answer by leaning quite heavily on the words of Sir David Oman, so the ex-head of GCHQ, titan of the national security field, who invented the whole framework of the 4 Ps of contest. I mean, he said in chapter 10 of his book How to Think Like a Spy. And I was looking at this morning because I could see the Times were covering what I said about subversion. His chapter 10 is entitled Subversion and Sedition in the Internet Era. And his view is that it is the internet precisely that has laid us open to a new field of subversion and sedition. And I think that must be absolutely right with respect. It's certainly the case in my experience with terrorism. It's changed the face of terrorism. It's undoubtedly changed the way in which intelligence operatives operate. But I also heard him at an event say that the real problem with the internet is that the IP address went to your computer, but not to an individual. In other words, people, the whole way the internet is set up, it's not accountable to people. And I completely agree with you. I think that anonymity is the total vice here. I entirely recognise that there are people who need to be anonymous. Sources, for example, for the many excellent journalists here. I would be surprised if there isn't some sort of mechanism that couldn't be created so that a social media platform would tolerate anonymous accounts in certain circumstances, where it's clear they're being operated by a mainstream journalist or where there's some other way of accrediting their bona fides. But anonymity online is, of course, a problem. It's why people turn up at demos and behave really badly wearing masks.
One last question. I'm sorry if I disappoint anyone. I'm just trying to see who wants to ask questions. The glare of the light.
There's a gentleman there and a gentleman there.
Okay, two more. One there, one there. We'll take them as a pair, please. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. Douglas Weeks, California State University, Long Beach. I'm a long way from home. I wanted to pick up on your discussion on subversion a bit more, in the sense that I think that this is a new threat that we really have not come to grips with yet. We've done a good job in the UK and other places in the West at disrupting more traditional terrorist type threats. But one of the things that I think, and it's been pointed out that the role that social media has had in this and the IP platforms that are available to people certainly are the mechanisms that is now becoming more of an issue. But I think that the platforms themselves are nothing more than that. Where we're running into problems is more in the age of misinformation and disinformation. And that seems to be playing large in the entire role of what's going on within societies. Any thoughts on that from your perspective?
Another question over there. Final question.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ewan Smith from UCL Laws. Can we learn anything from our experience countering democratic subversion during the Cold War, or is all of this new?
Responding to your question, Ewan, I think the answer is yes, we can, particularly because the current principal adversary, Russia, is using the very same tactics that it was using during the Cold War. I say that obviously with a degree of reticence and caution because no one wants to resurrect certain overreactions and misassessments that led to strong senses of paranoia. But I think in principle, yes, because it's the same people, frankly. On the gentleman's question about disinformation and misinformation, I think if I understand what you're saying, I strongly agree with you, which is it's not about platform accountability. Platforms are businesses, they will adapt, as we know, with the win, they're one day this, they're one day that. You know, when Trump comes in, they give him $1 billion, whatever. That's where they are. It's about the reception on the people, and therefore we need to look at how disinformation and misinformation is either accepted or rejected by the people who consume it, because we're the ones, ultimately, we're the ones who are going to cause the harm. The thing that worries me most about this is that it could be anyone in this room or anyone's children in this room who are ultimately the consumers of terrorist material, maybe because there's some bad terrorist guy trying to target in, or it may just because they're curious and they go down their rabbit hole, but now also they're at risk of seeing a tasking package on Telegram and saying, that's a cool $1,000 or £500 or whatever, I'm going to go and do something. So yes.
Brilliant. Well, if nobody leaving the room, bar one person, is a measure of the success of the speech, this has been absolute triumph. Could have heard a pin drop throughout the whole of this. And so, Jonathan, real masterclass here today, set the highest of standards for this lecture for years to come, a worthy and fitting memorial to John Creaney. Please come back soon. Thank you for everything, and a reminder to all the journalists that if you really are quality journalists, you'll say that Policy Exchange is the greatest think tank.